Hello, everyone. On behalf of the JCPA, Israel Action Network, JCRC of Greater Washington, and Israel Policy Forum, thank you very much for joining us for our webinar about the current political situation in Israel. My name is Cookie Heimer-Blitz, and I am a past president of the JCRC of Greater Washington's Board of Directors, as well as an active member of many of today's sponsoring organizations. At the start of the pandemic, Israel was in the midst of government negotiations after more than a year of campaigns, elections, and more negotiations. Tomorrow, Israel will swear in a new emergency unity government. With this new unity government in place, what can we expect in the coming year? What are the government's priorities, and how has the pandemic affected Israel's governmental processes? The sponsoring organizations have come together to hold this webinar to provide insight into these topics for the community. We look forward to hearing the perspectives and expertise from our speakers, Israeli journalist Tal Shalev, and Israel Policy Forum's Policy Director, Dr. Michael Koplow. We thank the Israel Policy Forum for providing their expertise in this subject, and we look forward in the future to providing a variety of viewpoints on this topic. Tal Shalev is the chief political and diplomatic correspondent for Walla News, one of Israel's largest websites that provides independent breaking news and analysis 24 hours a day. She covers Israel's prime minister, government, and parliament, as well as the country's foreign and diplomatic affairs. Michael Caplo is the policy director of the Israel Policy Forum. Before coming to Israel Policy Forum, he was the founding program director of the Israel Institute. He writes Israel Policy Forum's weekly Koplow column and edits the Israel Policy Exchange, which is a leading source for commentary and analysis on Israel and American Jewry. And his work regularly appears in Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, The Atlantic, and The Forward, among other publications. I will begin by asking each of our speakers a couple of initial questions before opening it up to questions from the audience. If you would like to ask a question of either of our speakers, please do so by using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Michael, my first question goes to you. Can you please give us a sense of the political situation in Israel as it stands today? After nearly a year and a half of elections in Israel, is the new emergency unity government a good end result for Israelis to this whole process? And what are the main priorities of the new government, and who are the key players?
Thanks so much, Cookie, and thanks to JCPA and all the other sponsoring organizations. And it's always great to be listening to Tal, let alone being alongside Tal. So as you know, as of tomorrow, when the government gets sworn in, Israel will have its first new permanent government in over a year. And there are a number of important implications to this. And first and foremost is the ability of the government to deal with coronavirus and any other situation that has cropped up over the past year. Because there has not been a permanent government, it's been impossible for the Knesset to, for instance, pass a new budget. And so ministries have been operating every month with a 1/12 of the previous budget. And so particularly, when you're in the middle of something like coronavirus, it makes it difficult to deal with. So I think first and foremost, it's certainly a good result for Israelis, and that hopefully this will mean that ministries can get new budgets and policy making can proceed in a way that it should, as opposed to being stuck where it's been for the past year. Second, of course, Israelis have now had 3 elections over the course of 11 months, and that in itself is obviously an unprecedented and unique situation for Israel. But beyond the fact that Israelis had to keep on going out to vote, there is certainly something to be said for, I think, the tenor of political debate when you have constant campaigns. And so hopefully, while Israeli politics tends to be rough and tumble and in some ways as polarized as we have here in the United States these days, the fact that at this point, at least as the agreement sets forth, Israel is not supposed to be going to elections for another 4 years. Hopefully, there will be some perhaps lessening of the temperature when it comes to political issues. Now, one of the other things about this new government is that because it is a unity government, you have a number of new people coming in, both from Koplow, who, of course, were not in government before, as the party didn't exist, but also you have a shakeup in a lot of the top people who will be manning ministries. And so, while Prime Minister Netanyahu is familiar to everybody and is staying where he is for now, Israel is going to have a new defense minister in Benny Gantz. And I should note somebody who's never served as defense minister, a new foreign minister in Gabi Ashkenazi, somebody else who has never served as foreign minister or as any minister. You have Yuli Edelstein, who was the Knesset speaker, moving over to the health ministry, and so you have a lot of you have a new justice minister in Avi Nissenkorn, and somebody else who's never been a minister. So you have a lot of turnover, and that will impact things as well. And then finally, and then I'll turn things over to Tal, since she's actually on the ground there and can talk about many of these issues more cogently than I can. Finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up the big policy issue looming over all of this, which is annexation, particularly in light of the fact that Secretary Pompeo was in Israel today for a brief visit, where he met with the Prime Minister, along with, I should say, not along with, separately, with Benny Gantz and with Gabi Ashkenazi. And he reportedly talked about a number of things, including the situation with Iran and imparting U.S. views on cooperation between Israel and China, which has really actually become the big, if not only, point of contention between Israel and the Trump administration. But he also spoke about the plan for annexation that is envisioned by the Trump plan. And the coalition agreement that Netanyahu and Gantz signed explicitly incorporates annexation as something that can go forward beginning July 1st. And it explicitly says that any annexation that goes forward will be done in coordination with the plan that the Trump administration has advanced and approved. And so, this is a big policy issue that this new government is going to have to deal with. And I think it's an open question. There are lots of views on both sides as to whether Netanyahu is actually likely to pursue annexation beginning July 1st, or whether he will hold off or try to make the issue go away altogether. But it's certainly something that he's been talking about for the past year plus, since the campaign before the first election. And given the involvement now of the United States and the fact that it is explicitly part of this coalition agreement, I think it's the policy issue that is probably going to be in the headlines over the next few months. And if it goes forward, it's going to raise a whole new set of issues that Israel is going to have to deal with alongside coronavirus.
Great. Thank you. Tal, question for you. As a journalist residing in Israel, can you provide us with more insight on what you're seeing on the ground? Particularly, how has the Israeli public reacted to the formation of the new government? And how do you think the COVID-19 pandemic has affected its democratic processes? Did anything about the formation of this new government surprise you?
Hi, hi everyone. I'm happy to be here. So first of all, I think that COVID-19 basically cured Israel temporarily from the political illness it has been dealing with in the past year. I'm saying temporarily because it's true that this government has a very strict agreement that abides it to at least 3 or 4 years, but most people that I speak to inside the political system do not actually believe that it will survive very long. People are skeptical that Benny Gantz will eventually turn prime minister. But to start off, and Michael presented it, I think, very accurately, after a year of unstableness, of instability, Excuse me if I make English mistakes. It's late at night. So anyway, after such a long year, and it was a very hard year of a lot of dirty political campaigns, and Israelis really were fed up. The notion of a fourth election in this situation, dealing with the COVID-19, at the time seemed unbearable. At the time that Benny Gantz broke up Blue and White and signed the agreement with Netanyahu, we were at the peak of the COVID, I would say, hysteria here in Israel. Everyone was in lockdown. Now we're a month later and everything looks totally different, but at the time, there was a lot of anxiety here, and Michael is correct that the government can't do much with the Knesset can't do much without having a new government, and the budget was the main issue. Now we're a month afterwards, so I think that if we can divide the reactions in the Israeli public to, I think, two sides. First, the first, I guess about 50%, most of them right-wing supporters, but 50% are very happy that finally a government is being formed. Definitely will make it easier to deal with the economic implications of the lockdown that are going to accompany us for the next few months. But I think that there's another, I don't know to amount them, but I guess it's somewhere between 40 to 50% of the population, of the voters and of the public, who feel a lot of distrust towards this government and also feel some sense of betrayal. First of all, this government, which has been sold to the public as an emergency government that is aimed at dealing with the corona, because the corona was the excuse for forming this government. It was the excuse for Blue and White joining Netanyahu's government under his terms. It's the government that is going to be formed is going to be the largest government that Israel has had in the past 10 years. Since 2009, it's going to have about 36 ministers. There aren't 36 ministries to have 36 ministers, but they're making up ministries for people just so they have jobs and they have some kind of, the honor and the job, and of course the resources which are applied to ministers as opposed to MKs. And also Blue and White eventually don't have any connection that's something that has to do with the corona. None of the economic portfolios, not the health ministry, not the finance ministry, not the defense ministry, which is now not really part of the story anymore. None of the main ministries that are going to deal with the crisis have been given to Blue and White. So it kind of discredits the notion that there was no choice than to form this government. And the main issue, I think, that is many Israeli, I think, center-left voters are dealing with is this huge sense of betrayal. Because if we put aside we just look at the numbers, at the election, after the election, there was a majority of 62 votes which voted for parties which their main election promise was that they would not sit with Netanyahu. Blue and White, Labor, Meretz, Israel Beitenu, the anti-Netanyahu bloc in an election campaign that was all about Netanyahu was 62, and Netanyahu's bloc was 58. But we're 2 months after the election, and Netanyahu, that anti-Netanyahu bloc, lost 20 seats to Netanyahu over 2 months. They lost Orly Levy, and then they lost Blue and White, and then they lost the Labor Party. And I think that I consider myself young, but people who have much more experience than me say that they don't remember such a huge gap between something, such a clear, I don't want to use the words betrayal because I think they're too harsh, but such a clear violation of an election promise. This was the center election promise of the campaign. Yes or no, Netanyahu. And 20 seats altogether just joined Netanyahu's government. And I think that this government eventually will be tested by their actions. So blue and white and the Labor Party might be able to overcome this criticism or this scrutiny, but it really depends on how this government will actually function and how much they will be influential on issues like annexation or on the issue of democracy. Now, you asked about democracy. I'm just going to make another point about democracy in Israel during the COVID. So on the one hand, there was a sense this lockdown was very, very scary in a way. And as you know, the military and the security apparatus has a very important place in our lives altogether. But during the COVID, and especially during the initial emergency mode, there have been a lot of intrusive surveillance methods that were approved, and there was a sense that some of the decisions were made dark, somewhere dark. But I have to say that at the end of the day, we saw a very active Knesset on this issue. The Defense and Foreign Affairs Committee had a very extensive overview over some of these moves, and also the Supreme Court has actually, reinvented itself because of the COVID-19, because many of their debates and many of their discussions have been broadcast live. And this is something that's never happened in Israel, that some of the deliberations in the Supreme Court have been broadcasted live. So at the larger picture, it's actually been an interesting time for democracy. Just to end on one note, one of the problems with the agreement between Netanyahu and Gantz is that they had so much distrust between them that they built, a machine based on laws and many changes to basic laws, which basically the idea is to create a mechanism that will enable them to be able to work together in this kind of what we call a paritetic government. Now, this government in forming this coalition has meant a process in the past 3 weeks, legislation in the Knesset of a very far-reaching law, which has many changes to basic laws without a real discussion. And one of the strains on democracy will be that this agreement does weaken the Knesset, and it also puts a lot of strain on the separation of powers and the checks and balances. The Knesset in Israel is a very weak institution to begin with, and the agreement between Netanyahu and Gantz strengthens the government and weakens the Knesset very, very much. This agreement will come back to the Supreme Court in the upcoming weeks and months, and some of it could actually be disqualified by the Supreme Court. And if that happens in the next 6 months, that could be an exit point for election. If they disqualify something that is essential to the agreement, or one of the parts of legislation that could be disqualified, for instance, is the clause that enables Netanyahu to continue to sit as the alternate prime minister. When Gantz is prime minister, then he will be able to continue to sit in the government, even though he's being he's been indicted and he's going to start trial in the next 2 weeks. So there are parts, we're still not stable yet. There are still rocky roads ahead of us, and it's going to be very challenging. But I think that tomorrow night, after the government is sworn in, a majority of Israelis will have at least one less anxiety on their minds, and they'll have to, to see if this government actually does anything, or is just a political mechanism that is too big and too expensive. Only time will tell.
Thank you, Tal, for that analysis of anything but a simple situation. Michael, back to you. You have mentioned earlier about the coalition agreement that stipulates the possibility of applying sovereignty over or annexing parts of the West Bank beginning July 1. What impact could this have on Israel's warming relations within the region and ultimately on the future of the two-state solution?
I think there's no question that if annexation does indeed take place, no matter what form it assumes, it is going to present Israel with a number of difficulties in its relations with other countries in the region. So, for starters, and most pressingly, there is an issue with Jordan. Jordan is, of course, very sensitive to any changes in the status of the Jordan Valley. Jordan is also very sensitive to any changes in the status of Jerusalem because the 1994 peace treaty between Israel and Jordan actually provides Jordan with an official role in Muslim holy sites in East Jerusalem, and Jordan traditionally has controlled the Waqf, which is the organization, the Islamic organization that controls the Temple Mount. So Jordan is very sensitive to both of those places, and Jordan is also dealing with a population of its own that is majority Palestinian, and so not only is Jordan sensitive to these areas for geographic reasons, it brings up lots of political sensitivities inside of Jordan. The Jordanians have been very clear that any Israeli West Bank annexation, no matter how partial, is going to put a serious strain on relations between the two countries, is going to put a serious strain on security cooperation between the two countries, which is extensive, and may actually lead to the suspension of the Israeli-Jordanian peace treaty. And I don't think it's a coincidence that when Gantz and Ashkenazi in the past have spoken about annexation, they have always, over the past year, been careful to say that anything that may go forward really should take Jordanian opinion and interest into account. So I think there's no question that the relationship with Jordan is going to be the first and a very significant casualty of any annexation that takes place. With regard to other states in the region, there's a debate. On the one hand, a lot of the Gulf states that have developed better relations with Israel over the past few years have done so because of a shared interest in countering Iran, and certainly that is not going to go away. And I think that there were a lot of people who were expecting that countries like Saudi Arabia or the UAE would be relatively quiet when it comes to Israeli annexation, and that perhaps you'd have statements from the Arab League, but no more than that. And in the past couple of weeks, and actually as recently as 2 days ago, there have actually been very strong public statements from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and from the UAE foreign minister warning about Israeli annexation, and that any warming of tides that has taken place will be very quickly reversed should annexation go forward. So I think that there's certainly a real risk to Israel in terms of its relations with other countries in the region should it proceed with annexation, and that will be the case whether it is a very expansive form of annexation, something like all of Area C, which is what Naftali Bennett has advocated, or if it's annexation in the context of the Trump plan, which would be about 30% of the West Bank. So no matter what it looks like, I think it's gonna cause problems with Israel's relations in the region. With regard to two states, that largely depends on the reaction from the Palestinians. Any type of annexation, no matter how partial, puts the Palestinian Authority in a bind, because the Palestinian Authority, as it is, has a real crisis of popularity and legitimacy in the West Bank. Despite that, it has continued security coordination with Israel in an extremely robust manner, where the two sides are really coordinating 365 days a year constantly. If Israel annexes parts of the West Bank unilaterally or applies sovereignty to Jewish communities inside of Judea and Samaria, it's going to put even more pressure on the Palestinian Authority, which, as it is, maintains things like security coordination, despite the fact that it is very unpopular with Palestinians. And if Palestinians end up viewing the Palestinian Authority even more than they do now as essentially being a subcontractor for Israel's presence in the West Bank and as being a subcontractor for Israeli annexation or application of sovereignty, it's going to be extremely difficult for the PA to continue security coordination with Israel. And it's also going to be extremely difficult for the PA to even remain stable as a political entity. And beyond the question of whether the PA can survive something like annexation, and to be clear, if the PA does not survive annexation, then it means that Israel has to go in and reoccupy militarily the entirety of the West Bank, much like it did during the Second Intifada. Beyond the question of PA viability, there's also the question of the Palestinian national project. The reason that two states remains viable is because you have had two sides that where majorities or at least pluralities support it. If there comes a point where Palestinians writ large say that they are no longer interested in a Palestinian state because they don't see it as being possible, and there, I think, is an excellent chance that annexation along the lines that the Trump plan allows will lead Palestinians to say that they no longer have a viable state, given that it will be only 70% of the West Bank, and that it will not be territorially contiguous, and that it won't be a sovereign state by any definition. If Palestinians look at that and turn around and say, you know what, we are done with our national project. At this point, we just want to have Israeli citizenship. If you're going to annex the West Bank, then make us citizens of Israel. At that point, it's very difficult to see how a two-state outcome remains possible, because you can only have a two-state outcome when both of those potential states actually want to have their own states. And at that point, Israel is in a real bind, because the question of Israel remaining both Jewish and democratic then does not become an academic exercise that might have to be considered decades from now. It becomes a question immediately as to the status of the 2.5 million Palestinians living in the West Bank and whether you grant them citizenship or not. And the answer to that question then determines whether Israel remains Jewish or remains democratic. But having both at that point becomes exceedingly difficult, if not impossible. So I don't think that anybody should kid themselves about what impending annexation might do, and I don't think that anybody should. Everybody should be clear-eyed about even the dangers that a small partial annexation brings.
Thank you for that very insightful answer. Tal, different tracked a little bit. Much has been said about the collapse of Israel's left. Is it truly collapsing? And if so, what might be done to revitalize it?
So it's collapsing. It's been collapsing for a while. Some people will say it's been collapsing since the beginning of the millennium, when Ehud Barak came back from the Camp David talks and said that there is no partner on the Palestinian side. Some people would say that it collapsed under Ehud Barak. Other people will say that it collapsed under Yair Lapid. I would say that under Netanyahu and Abbas, it has collapsed. The stalemate in the diplomatic arena, I think, in the past 6 years, and the fact that there hasn't been a real alternative to Netanyahu, ideological alternative to Netanyahu by his main competitors in the past few years, has it's an ongoing process, let's say, but definitely it has reached its lowest point. The Labor and Meretz party together had 7 seats in the last election. In 2015, they had 30, I think 29 seats together. So yes, a lot has been going. The Israeli left is definitely going through something, and the Labor Party, you know, once the main party, the ruling party of this country, is now with 3 seats in the Knesset. So for sure, the Israeli left is going through a process of probably killing its older institutions and reinventing itself. Just the reinvention part just hasn't begun yet. And it's a slow process. I've been covering the Labor Party, the Zionist Union, very closely since 2015. So think at how many leaders the party has had and where they are today. If you look at the turnover of the people between 2015 and today, most of the people that were elected to the Knesset from the Zionist Union in 2015 are not in the Knesset today. Main players, big players, Tzipi Livni, Isaac Herzog, Sheli Yachimovic, Stav Shafir, these people have been, I don't know, either kicked out or didn't survive the process, the very mean process of the left. And now, after basically the Labor Party and Meretz broke up, and the Labor Party is joining the government, and Meretz is staying on the outside with basically 3 or 4 seats, it's clear that there needs to be a new generation that restarts this whole process. That being said, one should, when we talk about the collapse of the left, one should notice, I think, follow very closely what's happening with the Joint Arab List, because the Joint List got in the past, from election cycle B to election cycle C, got 2 more seats. Many of them have come from Jewish voters. And the fact that there's been a personal turnover inside the Joint List, especially in Balad, if you think about the people who used to be in Balad, like Jamal Zakhalka or Khanin Zouabi, who had very bad images for Israeli Jews to vote for. Today, those people are not they don't represent Balad anymore. There are much more, I think, moderate people who have replaced them, and the Joint List is very strong today in the Knesset with 15 seats. And you're hearing more and more Jews talking about the fact that they're voting for the Joint List. So, and that being said, I think that that's the beginning of a process that should be starting, that if the Joint List, that if the left wants to reinvent itself, it's clear that it has to be about a joint, about coexistence, and about presenting an alternative, not only to the 2-state solution, but also to coexistence between Jews and Arabs inside the society, inside the Israeli borders, and integrating them into the political system at large. I think one of the most fascinating processes about this past year has been the evolving of the Joint List into a real significant player. Of course, a lot of this is credited to Ayman Oda, the leader of the Joint List. A lot of this is credited to Netanyahu himself, who, you know, made the Arab MKs his favorite, you know, his favorite campaign slogan against Benny Gantz. But at large, if we're looking, you know, at good things for the Israeli left, then I think that what is happening with the Joint List is probably a reason for optimism for the liberal people here in Israel, and also the acknowledgement that there needs to be Arab representation on other lists, on the Labor Party list eventually, even though during these 3 campaigns there hasn't been significant representation. But it's clear that one of the issues that, you know, the left needs to regenerate itself around has to be that issue of relationships with our Arab neighbors, Arab citizen neighbors.
Okay, thank you. And now we will open the floor to Q&A from our audience. If you have a question, please enter it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We will try to get to as many questions as we possibly can. And I'm sure that we will have a lot of questions. There's so much fertile ground to cover in this topic. First question, can Gantz, as the defense minister, do anything to stall a possible annexation of the Jordan Valley or settlements, maybe until after the November elections?
So it's a good question. Normally, the defense minister has more power and authority in the West Bank than any other figure inside of Israeli politics, which including the prime minister, because the defense minister is essentially the king of the West Bank. And so in normal circumstances, a defense minister would certainly have a large say as to what happens in the West Bank and with regard to something like annexation. And we've actually seen under current, at least until tomorrow, current defense minister Naftali Bennett, who within Israel's political system is probably the leading champion of beginning the process of annexation in the West Bank. As defense minister, he has done a lot to lay that groundwork. Whether it be approving large infrastructure projects in the West Bank that connect some of the farther flung settlements back into Israel, or choosing which demolition orders to carry out and which ones to not carry out, deciding when to ignore the establishment of hilltop outposts that are illegal under Israeli law, or to let them slide. So the defense minister has a lot of power over this sort of thing. In this case, it's more complicated because one of the initial holdups in the negotiations between Netanyahu and Gantz was over this issue of annexation, where Gantz wanted to have a say or even a veto over whether it goes forward. And what they ultimately agreed to was that the issue can come forward beginning July 1st. It cannot be held up by any minister or any committee, and it is under the sole purview of the currently serving prime minister, who will be Netanyahu, to decide whether or not it goes forward. Furthermore, to the extent that there will be a Knesset committee that has to advance it or sign off on it, that committee is the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee, and that committee is going to be chaired by Tzvi Hauser, who is one of the two members of Derech Eretz. For those who haven't been following all the ins and outs over the past couple of months, you may recall that Kachol Lavan, blue and white, was formed from three parties. One of those parties was Telem, which was former Defense Minister Ya'alon's party, and the two MKs he had with him were Yoaz Hendel and Tzvi Hauser. Yoaz Hendel and Tzvi Hauser both worked for Netanyahu in the past. They are both very ideologically right-wing, and particularly so when it comes to the West Bank. They are both proponents of West Bank annexation and application of Israeli sovereignty to settlements in an even more expansive way than the Trump plan envisions. And so when Gantz decided to join the government, Hauser and Hendel broke away from their own faction in Kachol Lavan, which was with Bogi Ya'alon. They formed their own two-person faction called Derech Eretz, and they joined with Gantz and Ashkenazi to enter the government. Hauser is the new chair of the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee in the Knesset. He is very much in favor of annexation in the West Bank. And so when you have the situation that the coalition agreement sets forth, it's difficult to see how Gantz, as defense minister, can put the brakes on it unless Netanyahu decides that he wants the process slowed down, and at that point he can, if he wants, put that responsibility or blame, depending on how you look at it, on Gantz. But that, frankly, will be entirely in Netanyahu's hands. If Netanyahu decides that he wants to proceed come July 1st, the real lever here isn't Gantz. It's really, I think, what the White House wants. And I think if the White House pushes him to go forward, he's not going to have much choice. And if the White House tells him to slow things down, similarly, he has to slow things down. And certainly, as defense minister, Gantz will have a lot of influence in the pace of how things take place. But once the cabinet or the Knesset decides that it's going to vote to apply sovereignty in the West Bank, I think, given the rules in place, there isn't going to be much that Gantz can do about it on his own.
Tal, you have anything to add? No?
No, just to say that I totally agree with Michael. We are back in a situation which basically says that everything in Israeli politics, I put it under the headline, it's all about the BB. It's all about what Netanyahu wants. You know, Gantz has this kind of paritetic, I don't know if that's the right translation, paritetic government in which, you know, he has the equal power with 19 seats. He has equal power to 58 seats. But essentially, Gantz doesn't really have anything to even threaten Netanyahu with, because Gantz definitely does not want to have another election in the upcoming year. So he essentially could threaten to leave the government over annexation if he doesn't succeed to influence it, but he doesn't really have that card. That being said, it's not only about Gantz in the defense ministry, it's also about Gabi Ashkenazi in the foreign ministry. One of the reasons that Gabi Ashkenazi wanted the foreign ministry was in order to try and play a role in the annexation. And one should note that today Gabi Ashkenazi had a very unprotocol-like meeting with Mike Pompeo during his visit here in Israel. It's very clear that Gantz and Ashkenazi want to create some kind of, I think, channel with their own private channel with the White House, one that does not go through David Friedman or Ron Dermer, and that they have their direct channel to the White House, and we might see a interesting, I think, dynamic evolving from the maybe Gantz and Ashkenazi and the security apparatus, by the way, who is also going to be against annexation moves, try and bring the pressure from the international community that would scare Netanyahu out of the move. But at the end of the day, it's all about Netanyahu and whatever green light he gets from the White House.
Thank you. Where does the new coalition leave the Arab bloc, especially we've been talking a lot about the issue of annexation, and do any of the areas that are considered for annexation in the Jordan Valley include Arab residents, and what could be the status of such residents?
So I'm sorry, I missed the first part of that. What was the...
About where does the new coalition leave the Arab bloc, particularly since annexation is such an important issue that we've talked so much about and is on the forefront of everybody's mind? And what about those Arab residents in the Jordan Valley? What will their status be, or what potentially could happen with them?
So I assume that first part is referring to the joint list, I think.
Yeah.
So I'll leave that one to Tal, but I'll quickly take the second part of it. So the exact map for annexation hasn't been laid out yet, because the Trump plan had two maps that it referred to as conceptual maps, so that we have a sense of the areas that are likely to be annexed. But there is now this joint mapping committee with 3 Israelis and 3 Americans who are determining the exact contours of what will be annexed and what will not be. Certainly, in any scenario, I expect the Jordan Valley will be in that initial annexation if it goes forward. So, in the map that Prime Minister Netanyahu unveiled right before the second election, which was when he came out a couple days before and said that if he was reelected, he would annex the Jordan Valley, and he stood up there with a map. It was the first time he'd actually ever unveiled a map with his vision of what annexation might look like. In that map, he had a large carve out for Jericho, which is the big Palestinian area in the Jordan Valley, and so that would have been a separate Palestinian enclave that would not get annexed into Israel. Even if you leave Jericho out, in the Jordan Valley itself, you are still talking about tens of thousands of Palestinians who live in Palestinian towns and villages, not counting Jericho, in the Jordan Valley. So, in a Jordan Valley annexation scenario, those Palestinians will be annexed to Israel, as will any Palestinians who are living in other parts of Area C that they get annexed to Israel. And so, the question is, when Palestinians who are living in that territory get subsumed into Israel, whether they get citizenship or not. And there are some people in Israel who advocate giving them or offering them citizenship. There are others who say not. I suspect that because anything that gets done will be done in coordination with the Trump administration, I think that it will be a lot more difficult for this to go forward if Palestinians living in annexed territory are not offered citizenship. And I think that similar to the situation in East Jerusalem, where Palestinian residents of East Jerusalem have the ability to apply for Israeli citizenship, and then Israel can decide whether to grant it to them or not. And the ones who don't, which are the vast majority, of about 330,000 Palestinians living in East Jerusalem, about 30,000 of them are Israeli citizens, and the others are Israeli residents. I think the same situation is likely to happen to Palestinians in annexed territory, where they're offered citizenship. Some of them will take it, and the ones who do not will be considered Israeli residents. So they will have blue Israeli ID cards that enable them to move around wherever they want and to access Israeli services, but they won't have the right to vote in the Knesset. But to the extent that happens, I think that will be largely a decision on the part of those Palestinians whether to accept citizenship or not, because among Palestinians, accepting Israeli citizenship is itself very politically fraught. Tal, I don't know if you want to answer that first question about the joint list.
I think that the joint list with this new government is probably basically in the same place it has been in the past few years. The joint list achievements basically in the parliament have always been based on their alliance. It's called the secret alliance in the Knesset with the Haredi ultra-Orthodox parties. Because they have many shared interests because of the fact that both the ultra-Orthodox and the Arab communities usually are underprivileged and in bad socioeconomic conditions. So that is their main alliance. And over the years, we have seen it's quite an outstanding cooperation between Arab MKs and ultra-Orthodox MKs. So they will still probably continue to try and get their interests through partnerships with ultra-Orthodox MKs. And also, I should say that probably their life is better off than it was before with Benny Gantz inside the government. It's true, that Gantz didn't form the minority government with the Arab MKs support like many people in the left wanted, but he did create some, a channel of cooperation with the leadership of the joint list, which is unprecedented. So I think that we will probably try and see Gantz also trying to, represent, try and, to expand his outreach and try to represent joint list interests, at least on civilian issues. Now about the annexation, they will probably be a very loud opposition in the joint list, but essentially they do not have any practical power to stop it or influence it whatsoever. It should be mentioned that Netanyahu has a majority of right-wing pro-annexation MKs in the Knesset. Even without Benny Gantz, there are about 67 MKs who support annexation and promote annexation, meaning that even without Benny Gantz, Netanyahu could have moved forward with annexation moves, and the idea or the rationale behind Gantz and Ashkenazi joining the government is their hope that they will be able to limit it or influence it from the inside. but Netanyahu doesn't need them altogether, so he can just go along and do it without them. And that's the situation. We talked about the collapse of the left. So after 10 or 20 years of the left collapsing, then today we are at a place where I guess 60 to 70% of the Jewish population, A, don't understand what annexation is, and B, are so fed up with waiting for negotiations with the Palestinians that are willing to support at least limited annexation or sovereignty moves.
Yeah, I mean,
Great.
just to sort of quickly pick up on that last point that Tal makes, the Israel Democracy Institute released a poll 2 days ago that found that 52% of Israeli Jews support, and the formulation they used was applying sovereignty to parts of Judea and Samaria in coordination with the Trump administration. Now, when you phrase it that way, that is almost certainly going to get majority support. Frankly, I'm surprised that it was only 52%. But I think a lot of it just depends on how it's framed, and that's that goes to a lot of this. When Tal says that Israelis don't necessarily understand what it is that they're looking at, I think there's a lot of confusion here in Israel, everywhere, about when we say the word annexation, what exactly we mean.
Okay, great. A little bit of a different direction. Where do both of you see the role of diaspora, specifically American Jews, in Israel's political present and future, and taking into account, of course, the many divisive issues and the sort of bumps in the road that we've seen recently and in the recent past?
You want to kick that off?
Start. Unfortunately, I'm not optimistic in that regard. I think that I don't see the relationship between Israel and diaspora Jews getting better under this government, just because it's still under, the control of the ultra-Orthodox parties, and at least under the influence of the ultra-Orthodox parties. So all of the stumbling points that have come up in the relationship in the past few years, if it has to do with the Kotel, if it has to do with conversion issues, they will continue to be an issue. Basically, this government will be a status quo government on anything that has to do with religion and state, so there won't be any change or progress on that. So it'll be very difficult, to repair the relationship when that is the main issue. And adding to that, if there is a move of annexation, looking ahead to November 2020, the whole bipartisanship issue, the Democratic Party is under, I would say, needs some PR here in Israel, because after 4 years of the Trump administration, many Israeli politicians, are openly hoping that Trump is reelected, which would make an option of Biden winning could create, some strain on the relationship in a way, at least public opinion wise. So I think that, and still it's true that Benny Gantz is inside the government, and he actually is also, his party is in control of the diaspora ministry, but I don't see how he will be able to create any other platform to repairing the relationship, because essentially the government is still mainly influenced by Netanyahu and his relationship with the United States on the political level, and B, the ultra-Orthodox parties who influence anything that happens here on the religious and pluralistic level.
Yeah, I agree with everything Tal said, and I'll add a few more things alongside it. In Israel, as Tal says, in a lot of ways, the Democratic Party needs a PR boost. I think here in the United States, among many American Jews, the Israeli government and Israelis need a PR boost, because in the same manner, many American Jews can't understand why it is that Trump is so popular in Israel, the same way that many Israelis don't understand why Trump is so unpopular among American Jews in the United States. So that dynamic isn't going anywhere, and I think it points to the fact that Israeli Jews and American Jews are moving farther apart faster than they ever have been in all sorts of ways. Their political preferences are different. Their religious preferences are different. The way they conceive of what it means to be Jewish is different. None of that is going away either. I also note it's interesting. The new diaspora affairs minister, I think, Tal, is Omer Yankelevich, right?
Not final yet.
Not final. Okay. Well, if it turns out to be her, she is the Haredi female member of Knesset from Kachol Lavan, and her English is excellent, and I personally find her to be very, very open and warm. But certainly having an ultra-Orthodox diaspora affairs minister, I think, is going to be different for many American Jews. And I guess finally, what I'd say on this issue is the difficulty arises in that Israel is two things simultaneously, and I think it's difficult for people on both sides to absorb. It's a state for citizens of Israel, which most of us American Jews are not, and it's also the Jewish state for Jews around the world. And there has to be some better balance, I think, on both sides, where Israel has some sort of mechanism for recognizing that Jews around the world, and American Jews in particular, who represent nearly 50% of world Jewry, want to have some sort of stake in Israel. And by that same token, I think it's incumbent for American Jews to understand that whatever that stake is in Israel is simply not going to happen on political issues, because we aren't citizens of Israel and we don't live there and we don't vote there. And so there has to be some better mechanism for leaving political decisions to Israelis, and American Jews are, of course, always welcome to offer their opinion and weigh in, but having more of an actual formalized role for American Jews and Jews around the world in religion and societal issues inside of Israel. And I think that until somehow that balance is achieved, you're going to have American Jewry and Israel having continued misunderstandings.
Okay, thank you. And I believe this will be the last question. Under the new government, will the High Court still be the odd man out, as it were, and subject to continued attack by the Knesset?
Can you repeat the question? I didn't get it.
Under the new government, will the High Court still be the odd man out, as it were, and subject to the continued attack by the Knesset?
Yeah, for sure. Yes. First of all, in 10 days' time, the Israeli Prime Minister, for the first time in history, is going to arrive at the Jerusalem court and open his trial for bribery and breach of trust. And the tension ahead of that with the Attorney General is, spiking in the past few days. Netanyahu and many Likud ministers are going to continue to attack the law enforcement bodies and the I think justice elite as part of his tactic, his his PR tactics ahead of the trial. And regarding the Supreme Court, yes, the Supreme Court is, as I mentioned earlier, the Supreme Court is going to overview the coalition agreement again, and is probably going to disqualify some of the items on it, which will be basically, just pour some more fuel into a burning issue in the hearts of the right-wing politicians. Now, there's something we didn't talk about during this talk, and that is the fact that as we speak, Naftali Bennett and Ayelet Shaked and the right-wing party, the national right-wing party, the religious Zionist party, Yamina, is not going to be part of the coalition. They are not, they're going to sit in the opposition for the first time. I don't know, it's definitely for the first time in the past 10 years since Netanyahu has been in power. And this is an issue, especially in the judicial aspect, because one of the things that they will be attacking Netanyahu time and again will be about the Supreme Court and their demand for a reform in the judicial system, and Netanyahu agreed to give over the Justice Ministry to Blue and White. So from Yamina, Bennett, Shaked, and Bezalel Smotrich point of view, that is the best platform to attack Netanyahu on. Every time the Supreme Court will overrule anything, it will be a good political platform, and I think it will continue to be probably one of the hot topics in the next Israeli government, and for sure, as long as Netanyahu's trial continues, because remember that at the end of the process, his verdict will be determined by the Supreme Court judges in a final appeal.
Thank you. And I'd like to say that we had over 50 wonderful questions from our audience, and I truly apologize that we couldn't get to all of them, but there's always more to be said, and we hope that we will do it again. And that's the perfect segue to thank you all on behalf of JCPA, Israel Action Network, JCRC of Greater Washington, and Israel Policy Forum. We're so delighted you could join us today, and a very special thank you to Tal and Michael. And Tal, yes, it is late there. We truly appreciate your presence with us. And if you'd like to learn more about any of the topics we covered today, we encourage you to check out the websites of our sponsoring organizations and sign up for their email list. We wish everyone a good evening and good health. Thank you.